There is a moment in every connection where truth reveals itself. And today, I want to talk to you about a pattern that feels confusing, painful, and deeply personal. Yet it has nothing to do with your inadequacy. Why is it that avoidants chase super empaths with intensity, only to retreat the moment the connection becomes real? Let me tell you something powerful. They don't run because you are too much. They run because you awaken what they have spent a lifetime avoiding. A super empath loves with presence. You don't skim the surface of connection, you dive. You see people, you feel them. You hold space for their fears without asking them to perform. And to an avoidant, that feels like oxygen after years of emotional suffocation. At first, you feel like home to them. You listen without judgment. You accept without conditions. You create emotional safety without demands. And that's why they chase. But here's the truth. Most people won't tell you. Safety feels dangerous to someone who learned love through distance. An avoidant doesn't fear love. They fear what love requires of them. Because love, real love, asks for presence. It asks for consistency. It asks for truth. And the moment your connection stops being exciting and starts being real, something inside them panics. You see, your empathy doesn't just comfort them. It reflects them. And when they look into your eyes, they don't just see love. They see the parts of themselves they've never healed. The abandoned child, the unmet needs, the emotions they learned to suppress just to survive. So what do? They pull away. Not because they don't care, not because the connection wasn't real, but because closeness threatens the identity they built around emotional self-protection. Avoidance learned early that depending on others leads to disappointment. So when you show up consistently, when you don't disappear, when you don't withdraw, when you don't play games, it creates an internal conflict. Their mind says, I want this. Their nervous system screams, this isn't safe. And here's where super empaths often get trapped. You start asking, what did I do wrong? You start shrinking your needs. You start overgiving, over-explaining, overweighting. But listen to me carefully. This is a divine lesson disguised as heartbreak. You were never meant to abandon yourself to make someone else feel safe. Your role was never to heal someone who refuses to face themselves. Your role was to love deeply without losing your center, to give generously without self-betrayal. Avoidants pull away because intimacy exposes the truth. Love is not control, it is surrender. And surrender terrifies those who learn to survive alone. But here is the transformation point for you. When someone pulls away from your warmth, you don't chase harder, you stand taller. When someone retreats from your consistency, you don't become inconsistent, you become clearer. When someone cannot meet your depth, you do not shallow yourself to fit their fear. Because the highest form of love is not attachment, it is alignment. And alignment means choosing someone who doesn't run when they feel deeply, but rises to meet it. Let this experience refine you, not harden you. Let it teach you boundaries, not bitterness. Let it remind you that your empathy is sacred, and sacred things are never meant to be wasted on those who cannot honor them. You are not here to convince anyone of your worth. You are here to be met in your truth, and the right connection will never make you feel like love is something you have to earn by disappearing. Remember this. Those who pull away from light are not rejecting the light. They are revealing where they are still afraid to see, and you keep shining. Avoidants are drawn to super empaths because their emotional depth feels safe, healing, and intoxicating at first. And this attraction is not accidental. It begins in a place of unconscious recognition. An avoidant has often spent a lifetime navigating relationships through distance, self-reliance, and emotional restraint. They learned early on that closeness came with disappointment, unpredictability, or pain. So they adapted by minimizing their needs and controlling how much they let others in. Then they encounter a super empath, someone who doesn't push, doesn't demand, and doesn't invade, but instead offers presence without pressure. And for the first time, something inside them exhales. A super empath has a unique way of making people feel emotionally held. You listen not to respond, but to understand. You create space where emotions are allowed to exist without judgment. You don't rush vulnerability, you invite it naturally. To an avoidant, this feels profoundly safe. It feels like finally being able to put down armor without being attacked. The empath's warmth doesn't feel intrusive. It feels gentle, patient, and accepting, and that gentleness is deeply disarming to someone who expects closeness to come with a cost. What makes this connection so intoxicating is that super empaths don't just offer attention, they offer attunement. They sense moods, unspoken emotions, and shifts in energy. They respond intuitively rather than reactively. For an avoidant who has learned to hide emotional needs even from themselves, this feels almost magical. Suddenly, they feel seen without having to explain themselves, understood without having to expose too much. The empath becomes a safe emotional mirror, reflecting care, validation, and calm. At this stage, the avoidant often shows up in ways that surprise even themselves. They may pursue, open up more than usual, or express feelings they typically keep locked away. This is not manipulation, it's relief. The super empath's presence activates a dormant part of them that longs for connection but has been buried under years of self-protection. The empath's emotional availability feels like a healing balm, soothing wounds the avoidant never consciously addressed. However, the safety the empath provides is not built on emotional avoidance, it's built on emotional truth. And this is where the seed of future conflict is quietly planted. The empath's depth invites authenticity. Their consistency invites trust. Their calm invites vulnerability. But for an avoidant, safety has always been associated with emotional distance, not emotional closeness. So while they feel nourished by the empath's presence, they are also being gently guided toward a level of intimacy that challenges their core survival strategies. The attraction is powerful because it is both comforting and unfamiliar. The avoidant is drawn to how the empath makes them feel grounded, accepted, and emotionally regulated. The empath becomes a nervous system stabilizer. Conversations feel easy. Silence feels safe. There is no pressure to perform or impress, and that emotional peace can feel almost intoxicating to someone who is used to staying in control through detachment. Yet even in this early phase, the avoidant is not consciously choosing closeness. They are responding to regulation. The empath's emotional steadiness calms their internal chaos. But because avoidants often outsource emotional safety rather than cultivate it internally, the connection can start to feel overwhelming once it deepens. The very qualities that T initially felt healing begin to stir fears about dependency, loss of autonomy, and emotional exposure. Still, the initial pull is undeniable. Super empaths represent what the avoidant has been missing, not because they complete them, but because they remind them of a part of themselves they had to silence. The attraction is rooted in safety, gentleness, and emotional presence, qualities that feel like home to the nervous system, even if the mind has learned to fear what home truly requires. Super empaths don't just offer care, they act as emotional mirrors, and this is why they so powerfully activate avoidance' unhealed wounds. When an avoidant connects with a super empath, something subtle but profound begins to happen. The empath's depth doesn't merely soothe, it reflects. And reflection is confronting for someone who has spent years learning how not to feel too much. The avoidant may not consciously recognize it, but the empath's presence gently brings buried emotions to the surface, awakening both longing and fear at the same time. Avoidants often carry unresolved emotional injuries from early relationships where closeness felt unsafe or unreliable. Instead of processing those experiences, they adapted by numbing, distancing, or intellectualizing their feelings. This strategy helped them survive, but it also froze certain emotional needs in time. When they meet a super empath, someone emotionally available, intuitive, and present, those frozen needs begin to thaw. The empath doesn't force this process. It happens naturally through warmth, curiosity, and genuine care. And that is precisely what makes it so destabilizing. The empath's ability to tune in creates moments where the avoidant feels deeply seen without having to over-explain. Their emotions are named, validated, and held in a way they may have never experienced before. This can be incredibly activating. On one hand, it feels relieving, almost euphoric, to finally have someone notice the parts of them that were ignored or dismissed in the past. On the other hand, being seen so clearly means the avoidant can no longer hide from their own unmet needs. The empath becomes a mirror that reflects not only love, but also pain. This is where the internal conflict begins. Desire rises because the connection feels real, meaningful, and emotionally nourishing. Fear rises because emotional closeness threatens the avoidant's protective identity. The empath's presence highlights the gap between who the avoidant learned to be, self-sufficient, detached, controlled, and who they actually are beneath the armor. That discrepancy creates anxiety. The avoidant may start to feel exposed, vulnerable, and uncertain, even if nothing externally has gone wrong. What makes this dynamic particularly intense is that super empaths don't just respond to what is said, they respond to what is felt. They notice shifts in energy, moments of withdrawal, and subtle emotional cues. When they gently ask questions or offer reassurance, it can feel intrusive to an avoidant, not because it is invasive, but because it reaches places the avoidant has spent years protecting. The empath's curiosity can feel like emotional nakedness. And emotional nakedness is terrifying to someone who equates vulnerability with loss of control. As a result, the avoidant may oscillate between moving closer and pulling away. They crave the warmth, yet fear the exposure. They want the connection, yet feel overwhelmed by what it awakens inside them. The empath unintentionally becomes a trigger, not because they are doing something wrong, but because they illuminate wounds that were never healed. This is why the avoidance behavior can feel confusing and contradictory. One moment they are open and affectionate, the next distant and guarded. Importantly, this reaction is not about the empath being too intense or demanding. It is about the empath's emotional clarity dissolving the avoidant's defenses. The mirror is too accurate. It reflects loneliness the avoidant denied, needs they minimized, and longing they suppressed. And facing those truths requires emotional courage the avoidant may not yet have developed. So the empath becomes both the source of comfort and the source of threat. They represent what the avoidant wants and what they fear. And until the avoidant is willing to confront their inner wounds, the mirror will feel unbearable because it shows not just the possibility of love, but the pain of everything that was never healed. For an avoidant, intimacy is not experienced as a natural progression of closeness. It is experienced as a loss of control. When emotional connection deepens, something inside them begins to interpret it as a threat rather than a bond. This reaction is rooted not in the present moment, but in earlier experiences where closeness came with unpredictability, emotional overwhelm, or unmet expectations. Over time, the avoidant learned that the safest way to exist in relationships was to remain emotionally self-contained. Independence became their shield, and distance became their comfort zone. As intimacy grows, the avoidant starts to feel a subtle but powerful internal pressure. Emotional closeness requires presence, responsiveness, and vulnerability. It asks them to be emotionally available in ways that contradict their survival strategy. Where a secure person might experience intimacy as grounding, an avoidant experiences it as constricting. The more emotionally bonded they feel, the more they fear losing autonomy over their time, emotions, and identity. It is not that they don't value connection, it is that they associate connection with being consumed or controlled. Vulnerability is especially threatening because it requires the avoidant to step outside of emotional self-reliance. To open up means to risk needing someone, and needing someone feels dangerous when past needs were ignored, dismissed, or punished. Intimacy invites the possibility of dependence, and dependence feels like weakness to someone who survived by standing alone. Even when the present partner is safe and supportive, the avoidant's nervous system reacts as if history is about to repeat itself. This is why intimacy can trigger a sudden urge to create space. As feelings deepen, the avoidant may become hyper-aware of expectations, real or imagined. Simple gestures of closeness, such as consistent communication or emotional check-ins, can start to feel like demands. The avoidant might think, what if I can't keep this up? Or what if I lose myself in this relationship? These fears often arise without conscious logic, driven instead by a nervous system conditioned to equate closeness with threat. Control becomes the avoidant's way of restoring internal balance. By pulling back, delaying responses, or emotionally disengaging, they regain a sense of autonomy. Distance allows them to regulate overwhelming feelings and reassert their independence. Unfortunately, this self-soothing strategy comes at the cost of connection. The partner may experience the withdrawal as rejection, while the avoidant experiences it as relief. Neither person is wrong. They are simply responding to intimacy through very different emotional blueprints. Another layer of this fear lies in emotional exposure. Intimacy requires honesty about feelings, needs, and fears, areas the avoidant may have never learned to navigate safely. Sharing emotions feels risky because it opens the door to judgment, disappointment, or emotional obligation. The avoidant may worry that once their inner world is fully seen, they will be expected to change, commit, or meet needs they don't trust themselves to sustain. This creates a deep tension between desire and self-doubt. As a result, the avoidant may unconsciously sabotage closeness. They may focus on minor flaws, question their feelings, or convince themselves that something is off. These mental strategies provide justification for pulling away without having to confront the real issue. Intimacy itself feels overwhelming. By retreating, they protect their sense of self, even though it perpetuates loneliness. At its core, the avoidant's fear is not of love, but of losing control over their emotional world. Intimacy asks for surrender, flexibility, and trust, qualities that feel unsafe to someone who learned that safety comes from staying guarded. Until the avoidant feels secure enough to risk vulnerability, closeness will continue to trigger the impulse to pull away, even when the connection itself is deeply wanted. When a super empath offers consistency, love, and emotional reliability, it creates an unexpected internal pressure for an avoidant. At first, this consistency feels soothing. It feels grounding to know someone is steady, emotionally available, and genuinely present. But over time, that very steadiness begins to activate discomfort. The avoidant's nervous system, shaped by experiences where closeness was unpredictable or overwhelming, starts to interpret consistency not as safety, but as an obligation they might fail to maintain. Super empaths naturally show up with reliability. They communicate clearly, they follow through, and they care deeply. They don't fluctuate in affection to create excitement. They create security through emotional presence. For someone with avoidant tendencies, this can feel like an invisible weight. The more the empath becomes, the more the avoidant feels an unspoken expectation to reciprocate at the same depth. Even when no demands are made, the avoidant may feel pressure simply because the empath's love is so freely given. This pressure doesn't come from the empath asking for more. It comes from the avoidant's fear of being unable to give enough. Consistency highlights their internal conflict. On one hand, they enjoy the warmth and stability. On the other hand, they worry about sustaining emotional availability long term. The thought of being relied upon can feel exhausting to someone who learned early that emotional responsibility was unsafe or overwhelming. The empath's dependability becomes a mirror reflecting the avoidant's own limitations and fears. As the bond deepens, the avoidant may start to feel watched, not in a controlling way, but in a way that activates self-consciousness. They become more aware of how their actions affect the empath. This awareness can feel constricting. Simple acts like regular communication or emotional check-ins can start to feel like obligations rather than choices. The avoidant may think, if I keep showing up like this, I'll lose my freedom, even though the empath has not restricted them in any way. This internal pressure often leads to a paradoxical reaction. The more love the empath gives, the more the avoidant pulls back. Not because the love is unwanted, but because it feels too steady to hide from. Inconsistency allows the avoider to reset the emotional intensity and regain a sense of control. By creating distance, they reduce the perceived expectation to be emotionally present and consistent themselves. Another layer of this pressure is the fear of disappointing the empath. Super empaths often hold space with patience and understanding, and avoidants can sense this. Instead of feeling empowered by it, they may feel intimidated by the empath's emotional capacity. They worry that they will eventually fall short, hurt the empath, or be seen as inadequate. Rather than face this potential failure, the avoidant may withdraw preemptively. the empath's love also disrupts the avoidant's familiar emotional rhythm. Avoidants are accustomed to managing relationships through independence and limited vulnerability. Consistent love introduces a new dynamic, one that requires emotional engagement over time. This sustained closeness can feel overwhelming even if it is healthy. The avoidant's nervous system, not yet trained to tolerate secure attachment, reacts by creating space as a form of self-regulation. Importantly, this dynamic is not caused by the empath loving too much. It is caused by the avoidant interpreting consistency as pressure rather than support. The empath's steadiness challenges the avoidant's belief that love must be earned through distance, or that closeness inevitably leads to loss of self. Until the avoidant learns to separate love from obligation, consistency will continue to feel heavier, than freeing, prompting the instinct to pull away even from a connection that feels deeply meaningful. Avoidants often carry a deeply ingrained confusion between emotional closeness and danger because vulnerability was never modeled to them as safe. In their early experiences, expressing needs, feelings, or dependence may have been met with dismissal, criticism, inconsistency, or emotional overwhelm. As a result, they learn to associate vulnerability not with connection, but with risk. Over time, this association becomes automatic. Emotional intimacy stops feeling like a bridge and starts feeling like a threat to emotional survival. For an avoidant, vulnerability is not simply sharing feelings, it is surrendering control. It means allowing another person access to their inner world. And that level of access feels unsafe when past experiences taught them that others cannot be relied upon. Emotional closeness creates exposure, and exposure feels like standing unprotected. Even when the present relationship is stable and caring, the avoidance nervous system reacts as if vulnerability will lead to pain, rejection, or loss of autonomy. This is why avoidants often intellectualize emotions rather than feel them. They may talk about feelings in abstract terms, but avoid fully experiencing them. Vulnerability requires embodiment. It requires feeling emotions in the body. And for someone who's survived by numbing or detaching, this can be deeply uncomfortable. Emotional closeness brings sensations that feel unfamiliar and unmanageable, such as longing, dependency, or tenderness. These sensations are interpreted as signals of danger rather than connection. When a super empath enters the picture, this confusion intensifies. Super empaths create emotional safety through presence, curiosity, and compassion. They invite vulnerability not through pressure, but through openness. However, for an avoidant, even gentle invitations can feel like demands. The empath's emotional fluency highlights the avoidant's discomfort with vulnerability. What feels natural and nourishing to the empath feels destabilizing to the avoidant. As closeness deepens, the avoidant may start to feel internally flooded. Emotional intimacy activates attachment needs that were long suppressed. Instead of recognizing these needs as human and valid, the avoidant interprets them as weaknesses. They may feel ashamed for wanting reassurance or closeness. This shame reinforces the belief that vulnerability is dangerous and should be avoided. Pulling away becomes a way to restore emotional equilibrium and suppress needs before they become overwhelming. Another reason avoidants equate vulnerability with danger is the fear of being changed by love. Emotional closeness requires adaptation, considering another person's feelings, adjusting habits, and sharing emotional space. To an avoidant, this can feel like losing their sense of self. They may fear that vulnerability will lead to expectations they cannot meet or identities they don't recognize. The risk of emotional entanglement feels like a threat to their independence. This fear is often compounded by perfectionism. Avoidants may believe that if they open up, they must do so perfectly. Any emotional misstep feels catastrophic. Rather than risk being imperfectly vulnerable, they choose emotional distance. Distance feels safer because it minimizes the chance of emotional failure. Vulnerability, in contrast, feels like stepping into uncertainty without a safety net. Importantly, this dynamic is not about a lack of desire for connection. Avoidants often long for intimacy but lack the internal framework to experience it as safe. Their confusion between vulnerability and danger is a learned response, not a conscious choice. When emotional closeness arises, their nervous system activates protective mechanisms designed to prevent harm, even when harm is not present. Until vulnerability is redefined as strength rather than risk, avoidance will continue to retreat from emotional closeness. What looks like indifference is often fear. What feels like rejection is often self-protection. Emotional intimacy challenges the avoidant's deepest beliefs about safety, and without healing, vulnerability will remain something to escape rather than embrace. When an avoidant pulls away, it is easy to interpret their behavior as rejection or a lack of care, but in most cases, the withdrawal has far less to do with the other person and more to do with an internal survival response. Avoidants learned early that emotional closeness could be overwhelming, destabilizing, or unsafe. So when connection deepens, their nervous system activates a familiar strategy: retreat. This retreat is not meant to punish or abandon, it is meant to protect. Self-protection is the core driver behind avoidant withdrawal. Emotional intimacy stirs feelings that were once too much to handle: longing, dependency, vulnerability, and fear of loss. These feelings can arrive all at once, flooding the avoidant's internal world. Rather than sit with this intensity, the avoidant instinctively creates space to regain emotional regulation. Pulling away becomes a way to calm the nervous system and restore a sense of inner balance. This is why avoidant withdrawal often happens suddenly, even after moments of closeness or warmth. Intimacy acts as a trigger, not because it is bad, but because it activates unresolved emotional wounds. The avoidant may not consciously understand what they are reacting to. They might simply feel overwhelmed, restless, or uneasy. Distance provides relief from these sensations, allowing them to feel grounded again. In this sense, pulling away is less a decision and more a reflex. Importantly, this withdrawal is not a statement about the worth or lovability of the other person. Avoidants often care deeply, but caring itself can feel threatening. Emotional investment increases the perceived risk of pain. The more meaningful the connection becomes, the more the avoidant's protective instincts intensify. Creating distance reduces the emotional stakes and restores a sense of control. Avoidants also pull away to protect themselves from perceived expectations. Even when none are explicitly stated, emotional closeness can create an internal narrative of obligation. The avoidant may worry about being needed, relied upon, or expected to show up consistently. These fears are rooted in past experiences where emotional responsibility felt burdensome or unsafe. Withdrawal becomes a way to escape anticipated pressure before it becomes overwhelming. Another layer of self-protection involves identity. Avoidants often define themselves by independence and self-sufficiency. Deep connection challenges this identity by introducing interdependence. Rather than integrating closeness into their sense of self, the avoidant may feel threatened by it. Pulling away helps them reassert who they believe they are, someone who does not need others to feel whole or stable. This dynamic can be especially painful for emotionally open partners who may interpret the withdrawal as personal rejection. But for the avoidant, the retreat is not about pushing someone away, it is about pulling themselves back into safety. They are not running from the person, they are running from the emotional intensity within themselves until they learn healthier ways to regulate closeness. Distance remains their primary coping mechanism. Avoidance may even feel conflicted or guilty about pulling away. They might miss the connection while simultaneously fearing it. This internal tug-of-war can lead to mixed signals, moments of warmth followed by coldness. These inconsistencies are not intentional manipulation. They reflect the avoidant struggle between desire for connection and fear of vulnerability. Understanding this distinction is crucial. Avoidant withdrawal is an act of self-preservation, not a measure of how much they care. It reveals unhealed emotional patterns rather than conscious rejection. Without healing, the avoidant will continue to equate distance with safety, even when closeness is genuinely nurturing. Pulling away becomes their way of surviving emotional intensity, not a verdict on the value of the connection itself. The connection between a super empath and an avoidant often carries a deeper lesson that goes beyond romance or attachment. It becomes a mirror for the empath's own growth. While the experience can feel painful and confusing, it serves a Powerful purpose, teaching the super empath the difference between unconditional love and self-abandonment. This dynamic is not meant to diminish the empath. It is meant to awaken them to their own worth, boundaries, and capacity to choose reciprocity over longing. Super empaths are naturally wired to give. They sense pain quickly, respond with compassion, and often prioritize harmony over self-protection. In relationships with avoidance, this gift can slowly turn into overextension. The empath may give more patience, more understanding, more emotional labor, hoping that consistency and love will eventually create security. But the avoidance pattern reveals a truth the empath cannot ignore forever. Love alone cannot heal someone who is unwilling to face themselves. This realization is a pivotal moment. The empath begins to see that empathy without boundaries leads to exhaustion. Each withdrawal from the avoidant becomes an invitation, not to chase, but to reflect. Why am I staying present in a dynamic that asks me to shrink my needs? Why am I interpreting inconsistency as something I must tolerate rather than something I can step away from? These questions guide the empath back to themselves. The lesson here is not to stop being loving, but to become discerning. Super empaths often equate love with endurance, believing that staying through difficulty proves their depth. But divine wisdom teaches that love is not measured by how much pain one can absorb. True love includes self-respect. It honors mutual effort, emotional availability, and shared responsibility. The avoidant dynamic exposes where the empath may be over-functioning, carrying the emotional weight of two people. As this awareness grows, the empath is challenged to redefine their standards. Instead of asking, "How can I be more understanding?" they begin to ask, "How does this relationship meet me?" This shift is transformative. It moves the empath from sacrifice to alignment. Boundaries become an act of love, not punishment, but protection of one's emotional energy. Choosing boundaries can feel uncomfortable at first, especially for empaths who are used to attuning to others before themselves. There may be guilt in stepping back, fear of being perceived as selfish, or sadness in letting go of potential. But this discomfort is part of the growth. It teaches the empath that honoring their needs does not make them less compassionate. It makes their compassion sustainable. The avoidant connection also teaches the empath the value of reciprocity. Love is not meant to be chased or proven. It is meant to be met. When one person consistently shows up while the other withdraws, the imbalance becomes clear. The empath learns that mutual availability is not too much to ask. It is the foundation of a healthy bond. This realization empowers them to choose partners who can meet their depth without fear. Ultimately, this dynamic invites the empath into a higher form of self-worth. They learn that their empathy is sacred, not something to be earned through suffering. They discover that walking away from inconsistency is not abandonment, it is alignment with self. The avoidant, in this sense, becomes a teacher, highlighting where the empath must choose themselves over potential, presence over hope, and reciprocity over endurance. Through this lesson, the empath emerges stronger, clearer, and more grounded. They carry forward their compassion, but now it is guided by wisdom. They no longer confuse love with self-sacrifice. Instead, they honor a deeper truth. Love that is meant for them will never require them to abandon themselves to receive it. Thank you for sharing your time and energy with me. It's been a pleasure connecting. Wishing you clarity, growth, and all the best. Goodbye for now.